Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're in Perek Hay of Sefer Nechemiah. And as you recall in Perek Hay, we are after the building of the walls. And after there was an element of security and somewhat success against Sanballat and his people. But after things calmed down a little bit from the immediate emergency, all of a sudden the normal domestic issues began to boil to the surface, which is not unusual when you think about politics in the world. You pass by the emergency, everyone's together for the emergency, figures it out, and then the economy becomes the issue. So if you look, if you look at the beginning of Perek Hay, a fascinating thing happens. There was this great outcry by the people and their wives against the rest of their brethren, the Jews. In other words, what the Malbim points out, that there was now the common folk were beginning to protest what was happening by the elitists, by the people who were the chorim, the people who were the wealthy, who, as we'll see, took advantage of them to a certain extent. It is one of the unusual cases in Tanakh where we'll have tzakata amun shehem. So the Dat Mikra points out that this was a mass rally that involved men and women, because ultimately the fear and the concern was so great that everyone came out. And it's just saying how big this protest was going to grow. Now, the protests involved a number of groups of people who were feeling oppressed and were oppressed. V'yesh asher omrim, there were some people who said, Banenu v'notenu anachnu rabim. Our sons and daughters are being mortgaged to be able for us to get the money. Rabim can be, as some suggest, there's a lot of them. But when you start looking in the dikduk itself, it doesn't make sense, anachnu rabim. Okay, anachnu rabim means there's some kind of action that we're taking. This is a poliotzem. It's not just a descriptive verb that says there are many of our children who are there, even though there are some who suggest such. The Mitzudat David inserts words, tzarchehem rabim, that their needs are great. But Rashi takes this approach that it comes from the word, rabim comes from the word ribit. No matter how you view this pasuk, and no matter how you try to explain it, the language is somewhat imprecise, and it could be perhaps, because if you think about it, if you ever watch on television, the people who are at some kind of protest and they interview someone, when they're talking, if they're really tzihits, if it's not one of the spokespeople who's practiced his lines, but if someone is really, energized, he's really upset and everything else along the way, the language isn't always that good. It's like it's choppy. They sometimes skip words. They're just so upset at what's going on. So it could be that this form of language here is like that to also try to mimic how people would be. We don't know for sure, but Malbim has the easiest way, that we have had to mortgage our children. We've had to have our children out there at interest, in essence, in order for us to get grain and be able to survive. Yeah.
It sounds like there are two claims going on, Pasuk Aleph and Pasuk Beis, because it says and then it says
so we'll see in terms of the structure, we're going to have three vayeshes. There are those who are like this, there are those who are, and there are this, and there's this. So there's either two or three groups, depending. Some of them before should say just two groups. But the vayesh is not a vava mechalek. It's not, or mafrid, it's not one saying there's an outcry and then there is also those. But there's an outcry, and among those who are crying out are this, and there are among those who are this, and among those who are this. The second group, v'yesh asher omrim, sidotenu v'chramenu v'atenu anachnu orvim. We've already had to put up our houses, our vineyards, our fields as guarantees against loans. V'nikcha dagan barav. And as a result, that's how we've been able to survive during this time, how we've been able to get the grain. In other words, the first group of people have nothing. So the only thing that they can put up to be able to get money are their children. The second group of people have something. So first, what they're saying is we put up our property. Okay, and that's what's been used in terms of an eravon. Interestingly, the Dat Mikra points this out. I didn't see any of the classic Meforshim. The Dat Mikra points out, if you have property, why don't you sell it? So why are you putting it up as, as a guarantee on things? And the Dat Mikra points out, because there's also a prohibition of selling land in Eretz Yisrael, litzmitut, okay, that we're not supposed to be selling land in Eretz Yisrael just to be able to raise funds in the normal fashion. And so what they're doing is they're doing the first step, even though they might have had to later on sell it, okay? And ultimately, okay, then comes V'yesh asher omrim, and there's a third group who says, Lavinu chesef lemidat hamelech. We've already borrowed, okay, to pay off the royal taxes. The midat hamelech we find elsewhere in the terminology of minda, balu. Okay, if you remember back in Ezra, we had that term. Midat hamelech is actually an Aramaic word. If you look in the Dalet, you'll see there's a dagesh, because that's the remnant nun that's there. I've always wondered if the word mandate and mindat comes from the same place. It'd be interesting to see. I haven't found it in a source like that. But we've had to borrow money to pay off the royal taxes. Stotenu uchramenu, and we've had to use again our fields and our vineyards. So it's possible that there are three groups. The way these three psukim talk about, there are three groups of people. They're the people who are, again, mortgaging their children to be able to get money, selling them into servitude, in essence. There are people who are borrowing money against their property. And then there's the people who had money, but they had to pay off the royal taxes, and now they have nothing to support their property. So there's a machloket as to whether or not it's three groups or two. If the last two are really the same, that the people who had mortgaged their property are really the ones who are saying, we paid off the royal taxes, and now we're also in this area or not. According to the simple reading of the text, it would seem to be three. But the Malbim suggests that this Pasuk, that actually Pasuk Dalet is a continuation. This is really the second group alone, and not the third group. And if you look at it, the way it can work, we have the group of people who've had to mortgage their children, and we have the group of people who've had to mortgage their property. That could be the two groups in that sense as well. None of it is very good. The Midat HaMelech, which we've encountered and we'll see later on, the royal tax, is a tax that was used to support the government. Now, who's the government in Yehuda right now? It's Nechemiah. And so Nechemiah actually is also part of the problem. The protest is not, Nechemiah, let's go rise up against all the rich people. It's, let's rise up against all the people who are taking our money, the rich people who have given us loans and now want to get paid back, and we don't have anything. The government, Nechemiah, who's also done it. So Nechemiah has a responsibility also in this response. Vatam, but the people aren't done with their plea. Vatar kivsar achenu b'sarenu kivnehem banenu. We are like them, and our children are like their children. Meaning, the rich people in Yehuda, who ultimately are oppressing us through these loans, who have means and are impoverishing us, we're no different than them. We're all Jews. We're all in this together. And nevertheless, why are they able to do what they're doing? And we are, against our will, normally to conquer. We're overpowering our sons. We're taking our sons and our daughters and we're selling them into servitude. And there are already some of our daughters who are already serving as shivchot by other people. And as a result, we have an obligation to get them out. There's an inyan of pidyon where we have to pay them back. Ultimately, nichbashot, okay, that if you remember, Hagam lichboshet hamalka imi babayit. Okay, when you remember back in Megillat Esther, Achashverosh goes to Haman and says, "Are you also planning lichboshet at ishti? You're going to conquer my wife." So we have the same verb used about people in that sense. Ve'ein le'el yadenu stotenu charamenu la'achim. We don't have the ability to redeem them. All of our property is in other people's hands. Yeah.
Nechemiah from Babylon or Babylonia or?
We don't know for sure. These are, let's put it this way, these are not, this parak is not viewing the classes of Jews as the Jews who had stayed back and were under the control of the Pachav Ever Nahar, or the Jews who would come, whether it's Zerubbabel, Nechemiah, etc., anyone in the middle. But this is just viewing them in two classes in terms of their finances. You have the wealthy and the poor. By the way, there's no middle class. Okay, wealthy and poor. The closest we have a middle class are the people who've had to mortgage their property. They once were middle class, but now they're impoverished as well. So what happens next? Vayichar li ma'od. So Nechemiah is the first person. Nechemiah says, this was troubled me greatly. Kasher shamati et zakatam, when I heard their cries, ve'et hadvarim ha'ela, and I also heard these other words. What were the other words? Well, they told me the situation, and then they told me the consequence of what's occurring. We haven't been able to do any pidyon. Vayichar li, it troubled me greatly, because as you'll see, Nechemiah is part of the problem. Vayimalech libi alai, and so I went ahead and I made this decision. Okay, as Rashi says, I consulted with myself. I consulted with myself. Okay, the Mitzudat David says the other way around. The other way around says, my heart drove my actions. Okay, libi atzoti litchazek b'davar. Okay, it was like I was my emotions now took control of myself. And what I decided to do was apply pressure over the upper class, the chorim and the skanim, the people who were the free people and the people who were the ministers. And I said to them, Masai ish ba'achiv atem noshim. Okay, what you're doing is you're oppressing people. And what I did is I brought against them a mob, basically a mass gathering against these wealthy people. Rashi explains that what Nechemiah does is he tells these people of means, you had an obligation to give tzedakah. You have an obligation to take care of them. And what are you doing? You're making money off of them. And in fact, this word neshech is ultimately referring back to Sefer Shmot, lo tesimuna alav neshech. Don't go ahead and oppress them in this fashion of charging them interest, of lending them money without giving them the money they should be having. And so Rashi continues and he says, "Hikalti v'asafti alehem kila gedola litzok alehem kedei levaisham." I went ahead and I manipulated the crowd to attack them, not physically, but to embarrass them to no end. I wanted this to continue. We went ahead. Notice Nechemiah is now including himself in that. Okay, and he said, we went ahead and we acquired our brethren, Jews, who hanim karim lagoyim kedevanu, and when they had been sold off, when we first came to, and they had been sold off to non-Jews, are you now going to go ahead? When we first came to Israel, we had to redeem all these Jews who had been taken captive, who were slaves, who were in servitude to the non-Jews. You're going to do the same thing now? And so the wealthy weren't able to respond. Nechemiah went ahead. First of all, he personalized it. He got the political pressure present. People aren't able to respond. Vayomar. And he said, Lo tov hadavar asher atem osim. What you're doing is wrong.
Bethlehem.
Yeah. Va'omra lahem, and he said to them, to all the people who had been gathered, that ultimately, kaninu et achenu hayudim animkarim lagoyim kedevanu. We had regained, we had purchased back, we had redeemed our brethren, the Jews who had been sold into the hands of the non-Jews when we first came to Eretz Yisrael.
They did do that?
Yeah.
Was that recorded?
Not recorded anywhere. Okay. And ultimately, Rashi says that what we had the ability, and now so we had redeemed them all, and now you're going to do the exact same thing. Yeah. Okay, then we sold to us. You're going to do the same thing that the Goyim. We went ahead. We had this whole Pidyon Shvuyim campaign. We got them all out of servitude. And now look what you're doing. You thought it was bad when the Goyim do it. It's worse when you do it. You're wrong what you're doing. It's not good. You need to walk with a sense of awe of God. You need to go with a sense of awe of God. You can't do what you're doing. From the shame of the non-Jews who are our enemies. The Malbim says that he makes two pleas to these people. Plea number one is, you gotta be Yirei Hashem. You have to do the right thing. You gotta be in awe of God. And by the way, if you're not good at being in awe of God, think about what the messages you're sending to the Goyim are. Okay, and Nechemiah is different than Ezra. Ezra pleads just with God. Ezra is the religious leader. Nechemiah is a very, very shrewd, in a positive sense, political leader. He tells them, listen, you don't want to be good Jews. You don't have to. I'm not telling you to be good Jews, but look at the political consequences of this. If this is how you treat your brothers, think about what the non-Jews are going to be saying about you right now. Yeah.
He's also calls him by name.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to say that.
Right.
He's calling a spade a spade.
He called 100%. Okay. He calls directly. He calls him. V'gam ani achayu narai noshim b'hem kesef v'dagan. Now, Nechemiah comes clean. He says, by the way, I'm doing the same thing, and so are the people around me. Nazvana tamasazeh. We are going to release them from all their debts. Now, why would Nechemiah have done this if he realized it was wrong? Well, Nechemiah is the government official. People have to pay taxes. And he probably had people who were collecting taxes and says, I really don't care how you collect the taxes. You got to get taxes. Yeah.
Sorry. Totally inflationary relief act.
Well, by the way, we could get into all sorts of things, right? We can get into modern politics. If you think about it, by the way, just think about for a moment. I'll give it a different without getting into that. Yeah, but without getting into this or without getting into that. Think about what's currently happening in the United States, right? We went through a pandemic, right? At the beginning of the pandemic, everyone came together. We dealt with a crisis. The crisis begins to wane, begins to pass. And then what's the big item on the agenda? The economy. Nechemiah goes through a crisis. The crisis is the safety and the building of the wall. They get through the crisis. Then the big thing that comes up is the economy. Now, the way he's going to resolve the economy issue is by forgiving student loans. He's going to be forgiving all loans. He's going to be getting rid of all of the loans. But what's different here and what's unique and what makes Nechemiah so unusual, he starts with himself. He takes personal responsibility for it. And when you take personal responsibility for something, okay, that's a higher measure of leadership. He says, we're going to do it first. And then he says, Hashivu na lahem kayom sidotehem karmehem zeitehem uvatehem. And now he tells all the rich people, okay, I did it. Now you do it. The same thing, return them. All return their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, their homes, uma'ata kesef, and all of the money, the ma'ata kesef, okay, that it meant to be me'ah kesef is the vast wealth. Remember, in the times of Tanakh, in ancient world, up until really modern times, whenever you have numbers, they weren't always that precise. So we know, for instance, that the word Elef just meant a lot. like vast. And so sometimes you'll use numbers. Now, halachically, we have times where we have to have bit precision. I still, and I know this is recorded and I apologize, but hopefully no one will see it who's going to get me in trouble. I still find it somewhat bizarre when people are davening vasikin with these atomic clocks that beep at precisely the second when you should be at Shemona Esrei. I understand that it's supposed to be right at sunrise, but I'm pretty sure that Chazal, when they talked about being right at sunrise, didn't have those atomic clocks to give it to the second. They understood where it was, and when it is, that's when you do it. Sometimes we take those measures to an extreme. It all goes, by the way, it goes back to classic, and there was a whole book written about this several years ago. It goes to the building of artillery, of cannons, where they had to be precise with measurements, because if the wall of the cannon wasn't the right thickness, and if it wasn't consistent thickness, it would blow up on them. And so this idea of precision and measurement is a relatively modern thing, not time of computers, but relatively modern, where they started to have that level of precision. Once you have that level of precision, we take it to an absolute extreme nowadays. Sometimes it just seems unusual. It's not necessarily bad, but seems very unusual. Here, when it says Me'at Kesef, it says simply that it just means a mispar gadol. It's a vast amount. Return that money. He's not telling the rich people, okay, you return 100 and you return 100, you return 100. Return the money. And also give them the grain and the wine and the olives that they're all looking for. Vayomru, and so the people said, Nashiv umehem lo nevakesh. We will give it back. We won't ask for anything. Kasher Tomer, just like you're telling us. But Nechemiah again says that's really nice, but ve'ekrat kohanim. He then brought in the religious leaders, ve'ashbiem, and he made them take a shvu'ah. Okay, now why the Kohanim coming with the Shvuah? Well, the Malbim says you bring in the Kohanim to take the Shvuah, it adds to the significance. It's more chamur, it's a more serious kind of event that you're taking. And as a result, he really doesn't want to take a chance. And the Shvuah is going to be, they're literally going to do this. There's not going to be any kind of options otherwise. Gam chatzni na'arti v'omara kacha. And I also shook out chatzni. Now, we're not really 100% sure what chatzni is. It's basically like I shook out my pockets. So the Mitzvah David says that's the corner of the garment where things, the hem, where things would get caught. So I emptied it out. It's a symbolic action. And he says, God will shake you out if you don't do it. So I'm doing this. Where do we find something like this? By the way, we find exact same symbolism with tashlich. Okay, tashlich, we never fed fish. Okay, there is some opinions that allow for throwing the breadcrumbs into the water to feed the fish. Okay, but what people would do symbolically is they would turn their pockets inside out. And just like we're turning our pockets out, that's how we want to remove sin from ourselves. Same thing here. Nechemiah gets up and he empties out whatever, the hem or the pocket, whatever it is, and he says that this is a symbol, what I'm asking of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do. Now, the Rambam says this is a klola. He's actually cursing him. He says, if you don't do this, you're going to be out. Mi beito, mi agio, and Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to throw you out from his house and from all of the things that you work for. You're going to end up being empty, shaken out and empty. Vayomru chol hakahal, amen. And everyone answered, okay. And they went ahead and they praised God. Now, what's the praising of God coming in here? Says the Malbim. If you think about it, Nechemiah just turned to these people and he said, I want you to forgive all the loans, whether it's student debt, whether it's any other action that's taking place. I want you to do all of this. And they did it. This was their personal wealth. It's much more than when the government says we're going to print more money. Okay, it's much more. It's a personal loss that all these people are taking on this. And at the end of it all, they're not upset. But the Malbim says they're doing it besimcha. That there's a sense of joy where they're praising God. Thank you for letting us do this. It's a fascinating ability. And remember how Nechemiah got his way. He got his way by public protest. He went ahead and he got the mob to go against these people, to pressure them. So you would normally think that they would do it, they would do it under protest. But it was the exact opposite, which was the power of persuasion that Nechemiah had. גם מיום אשר ציווה אותי להיות פחם בארץ יהודה משנת 20 ועד שנת 32 לארתחששת המלך, שנים 12, אני ואחי להם הפחם לא אכלתי. Okay. We enter into a new piece of the parak. The new piece of the parak is different. In other words, this crisis is averted. Now Nechemiah is looking back. This now is occurring at the end of his entire period of having been a governor over Yehuda. So we know, by the way, how long he was a governor based on this. He says clearly, also from the day in which I was commanded to be their governor in Eretz Yisrael, from the 20th year of Artaxerxes until the 32nd year of Artaxerxes. So this is the pasuk that tells us that Nechemiah was there for 12 years. Okay. Now, obviously, this isn't happening in the early years. This has to happen all the way at the end of the time. The question is, this till the end of the parak is what's happening. Is Nechemiah looking back at the end of his reign? He's looking back and he's giving us this report. Why is he going to give the report at that point? So Yoel Ben Nun has this fascinating approach, and I don't know if it's just his, but I haven't seen it anywhere else. He says, at the end, a person goes ahead and gives a report like this at the end of their time. If at the end of their time, there are complaints that he has to respond to, that there must have been at the end of Nechemiah's reign, there must have been some level of opposition to Nechemiah, that Nechemiah looked back and he had to give this report. And when we're putting together the Sefer, since this report is reporting about what happened in the first half, it's appended to this parak. But it tells you that Nechemiah wasn't always hailed as the great hero. In fact, in Chazal, Ezra Nechemiah is one book named Ezra. And the reason why it's named Ezra is Chazal were not 100% happy with Nechemiah. Ezra was the religious leader. Ezra did everything, as looking towards God. Nechemiah was a very practical political leader. There were things that he did that Chazal weren't 100% happy with. And so it could be that it wasn't just Chazal weren't happy with him always. It could be that he had this opposition at the end of his time.
Can you tell us what he did that was
Well, the kind of these power plays that he did along here were among some of the things. We'll see some of the later on also pieces that were somewhat controversial with Chazal. Looking back on it, and especially when we look back on it with a political sensitivity, it seems like he's a brilliant tactician. I was just telling Rabbi Berg yesterday when I was in graduate school, my master's, one of the professors, we had a course in leadership. I still remember the professor's name was Mel Heller. We were convinced he was related to Rav Heller. Okay, we think he was. But Mel Heller had us read 3 books for the course. The first book was Machiavelli, The Prince. You had to read it to understand that form of leadership. Then he had us read Boss, about the daily machine written by Mike Royko. And then he had us read Dale Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People. And those were the 3 books. The bottom line of the course was all 3 books are the same thing, just from different perspectives. You can take, when you tell somebody that he's acting in a Machiavellian way, most people mean it as a pejorative, as a negative, it's an insult. If you look at it, and if you're acting like Dale Carnegie, you're a very smart person who knows how to bring coalitions together. But when you look at them all together, they're the same. They really are the same thing. They are all the same thing. They just know how to wrap it in different packaging. And someone who acts in a Machiavellian way, even though common society says it's negative, in many ways, it's a brilliant politician. And so you can appreciate it. We can appreciate things from a political sense that isn't always 100%. And that's really where part of Chazal's objections with Nechemiah came from. Yeah, yeah.
There's similarities to Shlomo.
There's also, when he was being accused when at the time where they wanted to appoint a king, Moshe Rabbeinu had the accusations against him as well. Okay, all the great leaders get accused sometimes, even though they're not doing anything wrong. They get accused, and people do it. Lahavdil, elef havdalot. You find it even right now. Everybody, the queen died, and everybody is worshiping the queen. But if you go back 10 years or 15 years, you'll see, everybody was saying that costs too much. Who needs this or this and that? And probably if you go forward another 5-10 years, you'll have the same thing happening again. Yeah. There's certain things in today's time. There used to be, and I'm far afield, but we have, because it's a shorter paragraph, we have a couple of minutes extra. When Mike Myers was principal of the academy, you might remember this, Mara, when he was principal of the academy, instead of having freshmen learn Yoshua and Shoftim, which is normally what you learn, he had them learn Ezra and Nechemiah. And his opinion, and the reason he did it is Ezra Nechemiah speaks much more to us than a Yoshua and Shoftim does, because it's really a period of Shivat Zion. We're living in a period of Shivat Zion, and the troubles and recreating a Jewish country and things like that. We'll get to the issues of intermarriage. We had them in Ezra already, but we'll get to the real piece in Nechemiah. And a lot of the troubles that we have, we see right in here. Unfortunately, it's when you take an approach of teaching things that most people don't teach, so it gets a little complicated, sometimes controversial. So under the Mike's successor, they changed back to Yoshua and Shoftim. I'm happen to be Mike's successor. Okay, but which was a political move more than the educational. Having go back into the pasuk. So going back in the pasuk, it says, from the 20th year until the 32nd year, like Tachshash Melech, Shanim Shtei Esrei, there were 12 years that I was ruling. Ani v'achai lechem hapecha lo achalti. We did not take advantage of what should have come to the governor's possession. In other words, there's taxes that have to be paid. We get fed by government funds. We didn't take advantage of any of that. V'apachot harishonim asher lefanai ichbidu ala'am. But those who preceded me, they oppressed the people. They made it hard. Even after collecting the taxes, they took 40 shekel from everyone. They also insisted, this is Rashi, also insisted that they provide food on top of that. And also the lower level officials also were machbid. We're also causing this. We're also oppressing the people and taking from them. I didn't do it because being in awe of God. Okay, and I didn't do it. If you go back to the pasuk, continues via Reita Melokecha. That's in Kedoshim. Okay, it's a sense of awe of God, not to do this to other people. So Nechemiah is looking back and saying, I had these opportunities, I had the privilege of office, but I didn't use that privilege. And I was building this land, okay? And I was building the land. Building the wall, when you build the wall, in ancient times, Dr. Mikra points out, that means you get ownership over it. He says, I didn't even take a field. And we all worked that. Even though I could have, I didn't. And there were 150 people in my administration. Okay, and there were also people who were coming from the non-Jewish people, who all sat around my table. So he's saying I had these responsibilities, and yet I never used their resources. Just for the food I needed each day, included 1 ox for meat, some sheish bururot. We had 6 sheep. Who were chosen, choice sheep. Rashi Mitzudatzion says the Dat Mikra says they were, healthy, fat sheep who were there. That this is the okay, but Tziporim Naasuli. And birds, the fowl were made for me. Uven aseret yamim b'chol yayin laharbeh, and 10 days of wine was a large amount. Now, this 10 days of wine, Rashi says, they drank so much, these 150 people plus the non-Jews who were with me, that what normal people would have in 10 days, they knocked off in 1 day. Okay, so that this was all of this happening, and within the course of that single day, they were eating so much, and in fact, v'tziporim na'asuli. Okay. All Nechemiah ate, there was red meat galore. They were having barbecues. Nechemiah stuck with the chicken. Okay. It was a lower form. Nechemiah didn't take advantage whatsoever of his office. And as a result, he's saying at the end, what happens here? Zochrali Elokai l'tova. And he ends off with a tefillah. God, you should remember me for good. Kol asher asiti ala am, is all that I did for these people. Now, the reason why this pasuk, this last piece, this tefillat Nechemiah, is so unusual is because why would he have a tefillah now? Why is he praying at this point? Not every leader, after he does something good, does he pray to God, remember me. But if you think again about what Yoel bin Nun says about this parak, that this is a defense that Nechemiah is putting up against accusations at the end of his career. So he's saying, they don't remember me for good. Remember me for good. And I need you to remember me. And you understand why he would make that kind of comment along the way. Otherwise, it makes no sense whatsoever. That all of a sudden now on this piece, he begins his tefillah.
We don't see the accusation.
We don't see the accusation. They don't record the accusation, and it may never have happened. Remember, that's Yoel bin Nun's description of it. But let's put it this way, if we really ended this piece, like at the end of Pasuk Yud Gimel, that they're all happy and praising God, then why would Nechemiah have to say it again? And if they're all praising God, why does Nechemiah have to have his own tefillah? So as a result of it, we don't know. There's a lot we don't know on this piece. But what we do know is that Nechemiah was able to use political pressure and did it so successfully that those who were pressured thanked him afterwards. Okay, they understood it. They praised God for what happened. But somewhere down the road, Nechemiah had to mention it to him again later, 10, 12 years later, he had to mention it all over again so that they understood what he had done and the role he had taken. And he still had, at that point, when you pray to God, that means somebody's not remembering you for good if you're asking God to remember you for good. We're going to stop right here. We're going to pick up next week on the next parak.